Broadcasting from the commodity capital of the world, Zurich, Switzerland, this is Insider's Guide to Energy.
This edition to Insider's Guide to Energy is brought to you by Fidectis. Go to www.fidectis.com for more information.
Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me, as always, is co-host Johan Oberg. Johan, what's happening?
Hey, Chris, doing good. Moving forward another week in the rain, and I was about to say snow. It felt like it. I'm just waiting for the summer. Rain and water is going to be interesting for the episode today, though.
You already stole my thunder.
You've been out and about.
I was thinking the rain's filling the reservoirs and the rivers are running, and we're going to get some hydro out of this rain. So the last few days are probably a good thing for power.
For sure. But apart from that, before we jump into the show, I've seen you out and about a little bit this week.
Yeah, getting back to normal. So those of you that have been following my progress, I was out for a number of weeks after knee surgery, and now I'm out hopping around. I was also in Houston this week. Got to see some fans there. We spoke about ChatGPT in the energy industry, so I was on a panel that talked about that, and it was a really interesting conversation. So I spent a lot of time with our users and listeners in Houston. My next traveling is going to be in a couple of weeks. We're going to be in Boston with a bunch of our folks. So if you're an audience member in Boston, you want to catch up and have a beer with some of the show, just drop us a DM and we're happy to see you. But let's get into the show. People want to hear about what we have, and we have not talked hydro in a while.
Nope. No, you're right. And I think we touched on it in a few areas, and we kind of dipped our toe in different. So in this renewable eco grid, we kind of come into hydro all the time, but maybe not a deep down for quite some time. So I think this is going to be really interesting. Also then interesting to bring an expert from kind of the mecca of hydro, which we're actually located in. It's one of the largest, most advanced areas of hydropower. Obviously, for those who doesn't know us, we're in Switzerland, so that might help. But apart from us doing this, I think we should bring on our guest. So welcome to the show, Amédée Murisier, who's head of Hydropower Generation at Alpiq. Welcome.
Hi, guys.
It's great to have you on, Amédée. We've been discussing for quite some time, and we crossed our path career-wise a few years ago as well. So it's even more interesting to have you on. But for a lot of our audience, we always kick off this, and some of them might know you, some of them might not know you. So for the sake of our audience, maybe give a quick introduction to yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much, Johan. So, hi, everyone. My name is Amédée. I'm a civil engineer by training. I spent my early career in Switzerland working for hydropower already. Half of it maybe in the country, where most of the action at that time, 20 years ago, was in refurbishment and maintenance, and half of it in new builds, where 20 years ago, most of the action was in Southeastern Asia. And then I spent a couple of years in the US, nothing to do with energy. I came back in Switzerland in 2015. I've been with Alpiq since then, and I've been heading Alpiq's Hydropower Generation unit now since 2019.
So that's quite of a background in terms of this one. You're sitting on large assets in the hydro. We're going to come into that later on in terms of some new builds that also was delivered here in the last year or something. But maybe it's to kick off a little bit. You mentioned hydro has been around, so I think it's since 1800 something here in Switzerland. What do you see right now, and what is the differences? You talked about maintenance maybe before. What are the major trends? What are we seeing right now?
So I'm gonna certainly talk a little bit with a European perspective. Things might be different worldwide. Obviously, there is still a lot of new build ongoing in China, in Southeastern Asia, in South America also. But let's say from a European perspective, you're right. Hydro is a mature technology that has been around a long time. What has been interesting is that even with that maturity, things continue to move. We have seen different phases. Most of the hydro assets in Europe, and that might be a difference compared to global installed fleet. In Europe, most of the assets are merchant, so they're exposed to whatever wholesale market prices they are, and so we have lived through bust and boom cycles already quite a bit. Early 2000s, it was high prices. Then prices got really depressed in the 2000 to 2010. Then there was this early 2010 bubble, and then again a bust. 2015, 14, 16. That's the time when I joined Alpiq, and now again a boom cycle that has been ongoing for maybe the last 2 years. And so the trends in hydro reflect a bit what's happening on the markets, broadly speaking, which mean in a boom cycle you're looking at adding flexibility, adding market ability from your existing hydro fleet to try and capture market opportunities. And during the difficult cycles, you're looking at extract as much value as you can from the existing asset base, being as cost conscious as you can, leverage digitalization, leverage all the data that you have had for decades to make sure that you do not overspend on your fleet.
So I've seen a trend when I speak to people across the renewables that pumped hydro or pumped storage is a great use, right, for hydro, and that's get a lot of attention, and it's the proven storage at grid scale, right? That's been around for quite some time. I grew up about a mile or two from the Niagara Falls power dams, so I think that was around since the 1800s. It's been doing power for a long time. Um, in Switzerland, though, I also see a bunch of hydro whenever I'm out hiking or and around, and just there's a lot of hydro here, a lot of rivers and things like that. Is the trend towards pumped storage, or is it just as much hydro as we can get here in Switzerland?
It is. The trend is towards pump storage, and it's interesting because on a much longer cycle, this has already happened. So first, in the 1880s, 90s, when you first started to electrify neighborhoods or small cities, it was mostly driven by industrialization. They had this issue that the grid wasn't stable enough. So they were mostly hydro-based, runoff river. And when there was a peak of demand or a drop of demand, the grid that was purely regional with no connection to a larger grid was struggling to meet that flexibility. And so, as a matter of fact, in Alton, where you also were, Johan, a couple of years ago, there used to be, back in 1890, a small pumped hydro scheme up on a hill to make sure that the local grid was balanced. Then that disappeared when you had much broader grids with much more reserve coming in. It came back in the 70s together with the nuclear fleet, the construction of the nuclear fleet, because it was seen as the ideal um, complement to a nuclear fleet where you could store the energy that you cannot use at night, and it was difficult to reduce the output of the nuclear power plants at night. Then again, a very quiet time, and then he came back in the 2015, 10, 15, when it became clear that with the massive amount of renewable that were going to inject into the grid, that you needed that additional flexibility to be able to cope with the non-dispatchability of the renewable. And that really, we have been saying that for a long time, but now it's starting to really materialize.
So if we go back, if I heard you say you have the hydro as a kind of a complement to the nuclears back in the days, we're now seeing, especially in Germany and other countries as well, where we're moving away from nukes, even shutting them down a few weeks ago. Switzerland still has it, and many countries has. But how do you see then the pump hydro uh, being a part of the new energy system? How does that fit from your point of view, if you look at from a hydro point of view?
So from a pumped hydro point of view, the role of those power plants are completely moved from what it used to be. So there is this older pumped hydro plant that we are managing. It's close to Lake Geneva, on the shores of Lake Geneva, and I've looked at the dispatching of that plant back in the 80s. It has been operating since mid 70s, and there you would have the super classical, you turbine during the day when demand is high, so you start at 9 a.m. until 4 p.m. Then you stop for a while, and then you pump through all the night where there is excess electricity, and then you stop pumping at maybe 5 a.m. You have this quiet time, and then you restart. And those were super, super stable cycles that were really there to use some of the excess electricity that you had at night and store it for the night, and then reuse it the next morning. What we see now is a much more rapid, less predictable cycle that is not in terms of days, but maybe in terms of hours. So let's say you are at a special place in the marketplace or in the grid location where sun is shining super heavily and maybe in excess to what you thought it would be, and then prices collapse, or the grid operator is calling for removing power from the grid to keep it balanced, and that's where pumped hydro can react in a couple of minutes. Its dispatch ability is unmatched by any other technology. Batteries you can, but you don't have that much storage as we have in hydro in terms of sheer amount of energy that you can store in the lakes. And so the role has evolved from that, night day balancing role to a much more reactive, much more quick response grid stabilization role, if you want. Obviously, there is a commercial side to it, so we also try to see, where prices as lowest, then we pump, and vice versa. But what we see is a much more rapid change in price signals that makes us wind and unwind the power plants all the time.
How seasonal is the hydro, right? So I mean, the Alps get kind of frozen in the winter, and spring runoff I think produces quite a bit of water here. Um, is the capacity fluctuating quite a bit through the year here in Switzerland?
So hydro in Switzerland is quite seasonal. You have, maybe if I summarize, let's say compared to average Europe, it's more seasonal because you have more Alps. So you still have the Rhine River, where the big river in Europe, the Rhine, the Rhone River, they still have some water flowing during winter, but more in summer. But what we do have, and it's let's say the comparative weight in Switzerland is much bigger than what you would see in Europe or in Northern America, is we have storage. We have yearly storage. So those are lakes that we run on a yearly cycle. So typically you would end up the winter season where typically you need the most electricity with empty storages. You would store the snow melting water and the glacier melt and the rain during the summer into those lakes. Finish maybe early autumn, mid October with the filling season with full lakes, and then come down again until the next spring. So you have that yearly cycle. What we don't have compared to maybe Northern Europe is multi-year cycles, where you also use the water where you can shift water from, let's say, one year to the other one. We tend to have those yearly cycles. For pumped hydro, though, it's not the same because the lakes are smaller, so it's much more a daily, hourly, weekly cycle, maybe not those yearly cycle that is driven really by big storage that we have in the Alps.
So me and Chris, we're both skiers. We love our skiing. One of the reasons why we're staying here in Switzerland, and obviously you go up in the mountains in the winter time, and it's all white, and you get the glaciers. This year, though, maybe not so much, especially not the days I was able to go out and skiing. So in a year like this, let's assume that it was, at least my experience, we have less snow, or quite a bit of less snow. What becomes the actual impact for the larger pumped hydro assets?
So you're completely right. It was a super, it was an extraordinary year. There was very little snow, at least until mid-March. After that, the situation became a bit better, at least in the western part of the country. In the eastern part, southeastern part, it remains super difficult. And so the concrete impact is that you might not be able to fill up the lakes. At least the part that you get from snow melt is going to be missing for some portion, again, in the east part of Switzerland, much more than in the western parts. And I can speak to the portfolio of Alpiq, but it's roughly speaking 1/3 snow melt, 1/3 rain, and 1/3 glacier. That's what constitutes the water that you get into your reservoir at the end of one season. And so if that third is missing, the risk is that you are not able to fill up the reservoirs. Luckily, we started the winter with really, really full reservoirs because everyone was trying to be prepared for the energy crisis that didn't materialize. And so we still have quite a bit of water that we pushed from the winter to the late winter to be sure that we were in a good situation. So that risk of not being able to fully to have full reservoirs is a bit mitigated by the fact that we started super full. So it's not that bad, and luckily we had quite a bit of precipitation since mid-March, between mid-March and now. But in some areas, the areas closest to Italy, maybe you have seen Italy, the Po area is really suffering under a severe drought. So that will become a very challenging year.
How built up is the Swiss hydro system? Is there opportunity to add more storage easily, or is it a challenge based on the good spots are all gone?
So it's pretty built up in terms of valleys or portions of streams that you could equip with an hydropower plant. But the beauty of the topography of the geography is that as long as you have enough water, you can still do something with it. So as a matter of fact, everyone now is focusing on the winter production, winter storage, because that's where the situation is the most fragile, not only for Switzerland, but I would say entire Western Europe, at least maybe not far north, but for the rest of Europe, Central Europe. And what's possible to do is to heighten the dams, so to add additional capacity to existing dams, as long as you have enough water to fill that additional capacity. What's also possible is to connect existing lakes between them and to have additional pump storage capacity. So those two options, additional winter capacity and more pumped hydro, are both possible. Greenfield, new power plants, it's pretty much a done story.
And the expansion is the environmental legislation or the environmental impact enabling that in a timely. I know in the U.S., just with environmental concerns, it would be a very slow process
Yeah.
to try to consider damming something up or even probably expanding a dam would be my experience.
No, same story in Switzerland, even though I think the mentalities are starting to shift. So what's for sure is that if you're looking at a new valley or a new stream that isn't equipped yet, that is becoming very challenging to build something new, and not for bad reasons. There is so little space left without any impact from human activity that maybe you want to spare those spaces from hydro as well, and not only hydro but any kind of impact, because 90+% of all potential has been covered already, and it's the same story across Europe. So that is difficult, but I would say for good reasons. Heightening dams, adding additional capacity. The good thing is that the environment close to the dams has been already modified by human. So there weren't any lakes before, any storage lakes, and they have been created by mankind. And so I would say from a landscape protection point of view, those additional storage projects are not that difficult to sell or to gather acceptance, because they mostly impact something that is already man-made. We have a bit more of reaction. One project that is the biggest in the Swiss Alps for winter storage would be just upstream of Zermatt, at the bottom of the Gorner Glacier, of the glacier that comes out from the Monte Rosa massif. And there, it's a site that would be perfectly suited for a new dam. And the other advantage is that it would also help the local communities to prevent against flood risk, because it would retain water from storms. But it's a new dam, and their discussion is much more engaged in terms of what is acceptable. Can we accept a new dam there or not? What the country leadership has done, the government, is that they have established. So they have looked at the Swiss map, made a long list of all projects that would have potential, would focus on winter production, and they have established a short list of 15 projects, and now regulation is being put in place to accelerate those 15 projects. So it's a sign, that I think we have realized we need to move forward with those projects.
And you mentioned it would help with flooding and things, which brings the other kind of natural events we're seeing. We just saw a monsoon this week or big things across the world. I'm understanding that 100-year weather events are happening not every 100 years, that they're getting a lot closer. So here in Switzerland, one of the things that surprised me moving here, especially living in Zurich, where we have fountains in every corner and water running, people take fresh water for granted because
They
Switzerland
do.
has quite a bit. But at the same time, the glaciers are melting and the snowpack is not strong this year. So how is global warming or perhaps changes in weather patterns impacting European ability to have dams and hydro? Is that a problem? I mean, are you seeing that?
We are definitely seeing that. It's a problem, but it's not as big as one could think. And the answer is a bit long to make, but I'm afraid we'll have to go through that to understand what's actually happening. So purely on a production scale, so if you try to measure the impact of climate change on the electricity production in Switzerland, it's not that much. So the non-renewable glacier melt. So every glacier has some new ice being created over a season, right? And loses some ice down where the glacier tongue is. And when we have like now a massive disparition of glaciers across the Alps, then it's the non-renewable belt, right? So the glacier loses much more ice than it creates. So the non-renewable part of that ice loss, those ice losses, amounts to maybe, roughly speaking, 2 terawatt hours of production in Switzerland. So it would be something like 5%, 3 to 5% of the hydro production in Switzerland. So it's a number, but even for Switzerland, which is really hydro intensive, it's not that bad. So the rest comes from snow, comes from rain. Um, Obviously, if you have a dam on the just downstream of a big glacier, it will impact you more. But if you take the average for the country, we're talking maybe a couple of percentage points. Uh, what will massively change, though, is that today the glaciers function a bit like an insurance policy that you won't have in the future. So last week was extremely poor in terms of rain and snow, but the summer was so hot and there was so little snow coverage over glacier that the glacier melted terribly. And what's bad news in terms of glacier conservation was good news in terms of hydro production, because the glacier melt helped us compensate for that missing water that we didn't see materialize in terms of snow and rain. In the future, on average, over 10 years, 20 years, it's still going to be those 5% on average that are going to miss. But what you will see is a much higher variability of production, with some super dry years, some super wet years, and that buffering um, impact from glaciers is going to disappear.
So saying that, and we're going to get to a little bit talking about a new asset in Switzerland, or relatively new. What's the life expectancy of these assets or these hydro plants then? So if you know that it's going to diminish over time, just a few percent a year. Um, if a new project kicked off, let's say in 2022, I think there's one you can tell me about. Is that a 20-year, 30-year, or is it a 10-year projection?
No, it's much longer. So the life expectancy of large hydro is 80 years plus. So we're talking close to a century. Certainly, the big dams that were built in the 50s, 60s are going to be around for much longer than that. I think the difference, and just to be clear, it's not 5% a year of reduction, right? It's 5% total. So when the glaciers will have disappeared in 50,
Okay.
30 years' time, it's going to be overall 5% less, but with much higher variability, much higher risk of having super poor years in between, which will, I think, lead the existing storage that we have in the Alps to play a role that will be very different than what we have today. So today we use that water for electricity production. It might well be the case that quite soon we'll have competing uses for that water. So in a super dry year, maybe the water we will have stored, for example, let's say in Grande Xance, which is the biggest storage lake in Switzerland, well, maybe we will decide collectively to not use it to produce electricity, but to keep it as a drinking water reserve. Who knows? And today, the governance and the equipment to make that switch are not there. So you couldn't even if you want it. There is no governance in place. There is, who would have to manage that and find that balance between the competing uses. You would have to invent a new water governance, and that is certainly one of the biggest challenges we will face with climate change.
That was an interesting, because kind of tied into my question. We talked about the 80 plus years, and if we go back 100 years ago, then if you made an investment in something, you can predict it a little bit better. But we know that everything goes faster now, everything develops quicker. We start looking at the deployment of EVs, solar, and wind. It's in a speed that we haven't seen, and it just goes faster and faster and faster. So how does this then apply? How do you calculate a return on investment of 80 years when, if you go back 80 years is one thing, but moving forward 80 years, we have no idea.
Yeah.
We had a lady on here, our guest on here the other week, talking about fusion energy, and
Yeah.
suddenly there's a lot of things that can change, especially now with the focus on renewable energy in the next coming 10 years. So how does that work in terms of an 80-year projections?
That's certainly a big challenge, and you have to think in terms of fundamentals, because there is no discounted cash flow model that's going to spit you out, whether an IRR of 7 or 9% is enough to justify an investment over 8 years, because by the time you're there, all your revenue assumptions will be moot anyway, because the market will have evolved. Maybe there is no market anymore, but maybe the market will be different. Maybe the regulatory frame will be different. So really, you have to think in terms of fundamentals, and the fundamental for what we're discussing today, I think, are twofold. One, water storage is always going to be a necessity.
Hmm.
It's going to be a necessity for seasonal electricity production, but it's going to be a necessity for many other water uses. And so I wouldn't blink an eye in given the opportunity to invest in a big storage lake, because I'm sure they will keep value, even though I cannot predict what value streams will exactly materialize when. And the second one is pumped hydro, which has been uh, really battered by the market situation we had in 15, 16, 17, with a combination of low prices and low volatility. That's the poison pill for pump storage, if you think of pump storage as a merchant asset. Now we are seeing much higher volatility and higher prices, and we're back in the game again from a purely commercial perspective. But there again, the fundamental shouldn't be what you think the PFC is going to look like, the price forward curve is going to look like in the next 5 years, because that changes all the time anyway. It's tough to justify a multi-billion investment based on that. I think the fundamental is the flexibility need that the electricity system will have, and the competitiveness of pumped hydro technology compared to other flexibility providers.
So if we then look at investments, and what you guys did about 9 months ago, or a year ago, you opened up one of the largest hydro assets in Switzerland. We're now coming up to a year, or 9-10 months at least. What can you tell us? What is the initial learnings?
So there are there are quite a few learnings. So the first one is that I need to admit it, right? We started in 2000. We started with the construction. It was actually my first job out of university 18 years ago, was to select the civil contractor who would build the access tunnel to the future power plants. And so those are projects that last forever. That they are really, really long. And I'm certainly not pretending that everything has been super, right? Maybe we could be quicker in deploying those assets, but they will take time. And that's one challenge, is that you really have to put in place a framework that allows for investor confidence at the end, so that the investors put the money forward and take the risk of those long-lasting construction periods, because compared to batteries, obviously, regardless whether batteries are on a systemic level better or worse, there are different metrics and different ways you can look at that. But let's assume somebody thinks pumped hydro is a good thing. then the big impediment is that it takes really a long time to materialize it. And so for the next project, I would say learning is that we have to find ways to minimize that, to use existing infrastructure, to re-equip existing plants, to use existing dams, existing lakes, to minimize time to delivery, and to make sure that those assets are online when the system needs them. And the second learning would be supplier management. So that's maybe an hydro specific topic, but I'm sure it will resonate with people listening to us tonight in other areas. Supply chains have become more and more global, and we have yet to really see a nearshoring for large industrial equipment. We have yet to see a nearshoring, a real nearshoring impact. Everyone's talking about it, but nothing is yet really happening. And for us, it was a 2 billion plus project. Supplier management was the largest headache for construction, to make sure that the pieces we had ordered were delivered on time and with the required quality. As an example, we lost north of 2 years time of construction time because some big metal steel equipment that we had ordered when it came from China wasn't of sufficient quality, and we had to reorder them, and then they had to process the entire thing, and it costed 2 years. And so being the supply chains, I think we are reaching a place where the supply chains are becoming so complicated and long that we need to either being super proficient at managing them, but it's so dependent on geopolitical risks that maybe nearshoring is also an option we really need as a let's say on a European level or North American level. We really need to heavily consider. And the third learning, I was hinting at it before, is that the market moves so much quicker than the asset. And so there has been times when we are constructing that the updated business cases were showing no profitability at all, and then we started operations, and it has been actually quite profitable in the market or environment we are today. The machines, it has been a pain to make them run, but once they run really great and safely. And so those 9 months have been, I would say, a huge reward for all the blood and the sweat and the tears we have spent in the last 15 years, because it's running and it's actually commercially viable.
So when you say it's running, it's what, 900 megawatts? It's a pretty sizable
Yeah,
thing. It's full capacity is running right now,
full capacity 900 meg, yes.
and so your timing couldn't have been any better, right? This winter, although we had a mild winter that saved us here in Switzerland, but I think typically we end up buying fuel from Germany in the wintertime here in Switzerland, if I'm not mistaken,
Yes.
and that would have been a very bad year to have to do that. So you came online at perfect price volatility. I suspect that you couldn't have picked a better season to launch.
No, it was I would
From
lie
from
if
the
if
from
I
the from the investor point of view, not from the user point of view, right? But
exactly.
even the users in Switzerland, you know, want to make sure they have power.
Yeah, that's what we have witnessed. There is demand elasticity on the industrial side. There is no, or very little demand elasticity on the residential side or commercial side. And so people expect their power, expect their computer to launch when they need it. And it was a we hadn't planned it obviously, but it was a good year to be operational, to be in the market for pumped hydro. It's not too much like the fact that you were hinting at, which is true. We are importing normally from the north. That the overall balance isn't changing because of pumped hydro, because the storage is much shorter lasting than one season. So you would pump a couple of hours, maybe one night or maybe one weekend, and then use it the next day, the next week, and restart. So it's those are shorter cycles than you cannot optimize on a season basis, but on a weekly, daily basis. And so net, it doesn't change much in terms of you being dependent on imports. What it changes is that if you have a few hours that are really, really critical and that you cannot import from Germany for any reason, grid reason or whatsoever, pumped hydro will be there to help.
And then let's assume we get to a point where maybe prices come down. There's a lot of renewables coming into the market and things like that. Do you have users or other alternative uses near where you are to take advantage of it? So are you making hydrogen with this power, or are you doing other uses? Are there plans so if energy prices come down that you can use the capacity?
So the what's interesting is that the marker for profitability for pumped hydro is not too much price level. It's much more the variability, the volatility of the prices, and the spread between the highest hours and the lowest hours, and how much storage you have to extract those spreads. And so it's interesting because we have had a good year with the volatility we have seen, but it's tough, and we still have quite a few hours in the gray zone where you can't either turbine or pump because the prices are too high to be turbining and too low to be too high to be pumping and too low to be turbining. Right, there is this gray zone in the middle where, because of the cycle loss, with even though Nordrance is quite efficient, it still loses 20% uh, when you have pumped the water up to the lake and let it down again. So over one cycle, mostly because of friction of the water against the water pipes. And so to compensate for those 20%, you have to have sufficient spread. And so there are some hours in middle where you can't. And lower prices, like what we will see most likely, mostly in summer, thanks to the incredible push in renewable build up that we're seeing all over Europe, there might not mean that the flexibility is gone. In terms of market ability for a pump storage, as long as you have enough hours with a spread, you don't care whether the spread is between 0 and 20 euros or between 150 and 200 euros.
So when we look at, you mentioned we talked about this new setup. It's efficient. It has managed throughout this year. If you compare Nordrance, all the new equipment, this is state of the art. This is a new pump hydro, but it's based on old technology. It's actually pumping the hydro in one way or the other. So the technology itself, or the concept itself, is nothing new. Just out of curiosity, and here's where I have the opportunity to ask the stupid questions. What is the main difference in terms of efficiency and capacity when you look at maybe the 60-year-old hydro plant versus this one that is brand new coming out of the gates 9 months ago?
So speaking out of experience, because I mean the fully fledged answer to your question, which is not dumb at all, would require electronics and electrical knowledge that I don't have. But speaking from experience, if I compare um, Engrain-Léman, which is the pump storage plant from the 70s, with now Nordrance, so 50 years apart.
Yeah.
What really changes, so the basic principles is always the same. What really changes is how quickly you can switch modes. So from pumping to turbining or some regulation, you have also modes in between where your plant stays idle but can react within a couple of seconds to a push from the grid, either towards turbining or pumping. So what the real progress has been happening in the flexibility and reactivity of the machines. Not obviously the machine design has evolved, etc. But it's from a user perspective and not from an engineering perspective. The machines are more reactive, uh, get are much quicker to get from full load to full turbine to full pump and vice versa, uh, and are covering a much broader range of potential operational points along the curve. Whereas before, mostly in pumping, you had fixed points, so you had to pump at full speed or not pump at all, and you were quite kind of limited there. And that's with the new machine, it's not the case anymore.
Oh, that's I think that's an interesting thing, because we talked about this before in terms of it's the same technology, and on this show we try to look at, okay, but what are the technology advancements, and if it's purely mechanical, it's one thing. Is it also something around the digital approach in terms of how you can optimize, or is that the same technology in terms of the energy?
I would say there are two layers of it. So there is the machine itself. Obviously, the control and commands mechanisms and equipment of the machine have evolved dramatically with the digitalization of everything anyway. And so we have much more sensors. We have much finer ways to operate the machines and make sure they function properly. But fundamentally, it doesn't change a lot. So the physics is still the physics. It's still, steel turning and creating magnetic current and these currents. So that hasn't changed. The digitalization has made sure that we know much better what happens. Whereas before maybe we had to hear a little bit or to touch the machine to see whether it was moving or not. Now we can measure everything, but it hasn't changed fundamentally. It's really not like let me take something that has evolved much more drastically. You could compare it to combustion engines. Combustion engines still function the same, but it's not a jump from combustion to EV, for example. The second layer would be how you dispatch those machines in the market. That has seen a much quicker evolution. So it used to be manual with telephones. You were calling the plant and saying, "Hey guys, I need power in 15 minutes," and they would try to start and then call you back and say it's done. Now it's all automatized. It's much quicker cycles. So before, as I was saying in the beginning of the talk, we would have maybe 1 or 2 starts a day. Now we have 10, 20, 30 starts. So that has, the way the power plant functions and is dispatched day after day has changed dramatically.
Now, you work for a power producing or a company that generates power, and you're in the hydro group. What percentage of the company is focused on hydro? Are you the stepchild, or are you equally part of generation, or where do you fit in the bigger scheme for a power company?
So I mean, we would. I guess the company would reflect what you see in Switzerland. So in Switzerland, we have 60% of hydro, 35% of nuke, and the rest new renewable sources, which are now being built up, mostly solar. There isn't that much wind potential in Switzerland, and so that's exactly where our company is at. It's hydro heavy. Hydro is the reason why the company was created more than 100 years ago. It was already for hydro plants, so it's super close to our heart, to our DNA. Also because we are, I would say, over-indexed on flexible assets that require a lot of market knowledge, a lot of optimization knowledge to be dispatched correctly on the market, and that's super close to who we are as a company. So certainly not stepchild, but certainly most of the growth in the next 20, 30 years is not going to come from hydro in Switzerland. I'm quite bullish on hydro opportunities elsewhere, mostly pumped hydro, because that flexibility need that we talked about is going to be an European-wide problem, not specific to Switzerland. So that's a story that remains to be written for Alpiq, and then we'll see what happens.
Well, I think that was a great introduction. We talked about taking on someone on the show that really digs down, or dives down, maybe is the better word, into hydro. It was great having you on. I learned a lot that I should have known, having worked with hydro for a few years, but you always learn something new. That's what I like about this show. With that, I would like to thank you, Amédée. We're coming up to time. This is always the problem with the show when we have good discussions. But thanks a lot for coming on. Really appreciated the discussions. And Chris, any last words?
Now, I think it was exciting living here in Switzerland. You can't go anywhere without seeing the hydro. Having grown up right next to the Niagara Dam and being familiar with that, it's always been something that's been on my radar. So excited to see it. I was interested to find out the questions I had, because I really was wondering what the glacial melt impact would be, because we hear it and we see it. So that was an interesting reflection, and I look forward to watching how the new projects in storage go around here in Switzerland. So thank you very much for being a guest. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Chris, Johan. Thank you all. See you soon.
For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed this content as much as we had. It is so exciting. It's always fun to have great conversations. If you do, don't forget to subscribe. Follow us on YouTube. Don't forget about our Facebook channel. We're growing that as well. And we will see you again next week. Bye-bye.